Welcome to UGC E-Patashala course on History and Society of Japan. This module number is 21, titled Meiji Restoration. Actually, Meiji Restoration happened something like 150 years ago, to be precise in the year 1868, and it was actually a top-down revolution, not a bottom-up revolution where thousands or lakhs of people used to participate in anything of a revolution type. And this actually ended Tokugawa feudal system, which had actually called been dual system, Bakuhan in Japanese, that is provincial system, provincial states at the throughout Japan at different places, actually more than 250 places, and their leadership by name daimyos. Otherwise, it is shogun who central administration was in charge in the name of emperor. However, emperor was only namesake emperor. All the authorities were exercised by a genro, that is elder statesman, a council of senior experienced people and wise people. It's called elderly wise people. So, that type of a dual system that prevailed both at the center and the local level have been ended with the Meiji Restoration. We call it Meiji Restoration because authority of governing the entire nation, actually it was a empire, emperor in place who had a divine sanction, or it's called he wielded divine power, direct descendant of sun goddess Amaterasu, and this actually to be frank, Japanese imperial system is only system in the world which had till now continuing unbroken continuity of imperial family in terms of blood. Therefore, the sense of feeling belonging to one race, one culture is very strong in Japanese genes. Anyway, end of the dual system of administration, to be precise, end of Tokugawa period of 250 years of isolation of Japan for rest of the world's contact for all purposes, ended that system, and with the restoration of authority for ruling the nation being restored to end of dual system of administration, that is Bakuhan system in Japanese, marked the beginning of Meiji Restoration. That is Meiji Restoration definition wise, which is not a bottom up revolution, instead it was a top down revolution without involving any masses from the society, also which was not involving any bloodshed. It was only a namesake revolution because the reforms introduced due to Meiji Restoration had its impact deeply, widely throughout Japan for long period. Even now, traces of Meiji reforms can be seen in Japan, in the sense that where Japanese tradition and modernity both can be seen in present day Japan also. And Japanese are one such people, one such nation who have maintained clearly no loss of their traditional practices in society, but at the same time accepted every bit of modernization, the experiment that had begun from the Meiji Restoration in the year 1868 continuing till today in terms. But however, in a short time, that Meiji period, what we call, is from the year 1868 to 1912, and by 1912 when Meiji period ended, really Japan was at the league of international powers, that be in political, in military, and also in terms of territory. Japanese, which was a small kingdom limited only to the 4 main islands of Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku and Kyushu, by the end of Meiji Restoration, that was say the year 1912, Japan had become almost an empire in Asia, spreading beyond Japanese shores to Taiwan, to Manchuria, entire Korea. So, given this, Japanese empire was really a big one by the time Meiji period ended in the year 1912. This also is to be seen as end of feudal Japan with the entry into modern state. Feudal Japan, we say, because 90% of the population depended on agriculture directly for their livelihood, and revenue for the state came mainly from the agriculture in the form of tax and some taxes on other economic activities. This transformation from rural agrarian society to an industrial power is again another major feat of achievement by Meiji rulers. When we call pre-Meiji era, it is a specific reference to Tokugawa rule of 250 years of total isolation from Western contact. Battle of Sekigahara, which was in the year 1600, was the cornerstone by which Ieyasu Tokugawa won the battle, established his rule of Tokugawa era from 1602 to 1852, that is nearly 250 complete years is the period of Tokugawa Japan. Actually, Tokugawa Japan was an isolated Japan, and this was the period where we see the two system of administration prevailing. One, the central authority, head of the nation on representation by emperor, was called shogun. It was a military government, all the military discipline and all military authority resting with the shogun at the top, whereas at the local level it is the daimyos who were at the provincial level, the leaders, and there used to be quite often battle between them of smaller scale in order to show as to who is mightier than the others. Gradually, some of the most powerful and influential and who had accessed some weapons from the Western traders had shown their power, thereby extending their own authority in and around their own territory, thus becoming most influential. These were some of the families, some of the clans which were mostly in southern part of Japan, who became quite influential, who were actually the change masters, in the sense that transition from Tokugawa period, that is from feudal period into modern age into Meiji period, was actually a handiwork of these influential, powerful daimyo leaders, namely 4 families that participated in this kind of a restoration of authority from shogun to emperor are from 4 families only. 2 families actually are from Kyushu area, that is Satsuma and Hizen, and Tosa family is from Shikoku Island, and from the mainland Honshu, southernmost prefecture now is called Yamaguchi, which was actually of Choshu clan those days. These were the 4 major families which had participated in the transition of power from feudal to modern, that is from Tokugawa to Meiji period. Social hierarchy during Tokugawa period actually explains how the society was composed of, with clear so-called caste system. Social segregation was perfect. Emperor at the top, then it was shogun, that is a military. Next came the artisans, and then the farmers. At the bottom of it were actually merchants, because in Japan touching money was not considered to be a morally perfect activity for man. So, whoever were handling money in transaction, in dealing, in informal banking, or even to store wealth in the form of money, they were not much respected, though money was required for running any daimyo or any shogunal or any family or any merchant house, and therefore counting money, touching money, dealing with money was not since socially respected in Japan. They were at the bottom of the hierarchy in the society. So, merchants, then the artisans, then the farmers, then the shoguns, that is basically the military regime, the military people, military personnel, or to be very frank, most disciplined soldiers. This is how Japanese society was organized. However, these were not the only 4 clauses or 4 castes as we understand in Japanese society. Outside of these formal social sectors existed another caste, which is actually outcast, called in Japanese buraku. So, people who lived in the buraku were referred to as burakomans. Even in today's Japan, there are about 700,000 burakus according to some statistics opened by Buraku Kaiho Domai, located in Kobe. And at the same time, in the northernmost prefecture, where in Hokkaido, there are also a sizable number of about 8,000 people who are still called Ainus. They are the original inhabitants of Japan. But for these 2 major group of minorities who were belonging to outcasts those days, this is how the Japanese society was actually structured. That kind of a classified Japanese society was easy for even administration. whenever we talk about Meiji restoration, we must also talk about few years preceding Meiji restoration. Actually, opening up of Japan with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry in the year 1853, and also forcing Japan by giving first a few months of time to reconsider whether Japan would formally enter into commercial treaty with the US or not, and conclusion of the Treaty of Kanagawa in the year 1854 is the landmark for Japan towards modernization, which was to come later. But little before modernization, agreement through this Treaty of Kanagawa with Perry for US in particular gradually opened up Japan's foreign contact for trading purposes with other European powers also. Thus, the treaty concluded in the year 1854, Kanagawa Treaty actually got extended to other European powers also for trading purposes. Thus, Japan being closed for 250 years for all foreign contact purposes now stands open for trade with other European countries. Some of the slogans during the Meiji restoration, just years before that, when movement was gathering strength all through the nation, Sonno Joi, that is actually revere the emperor and expel the barbarian. This was some kind of a national program to move the people and create an environment and awareness that it is our emperor who is more important. The foreigners who are around must be kicked out of the nation's borders. So, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian became one of the popular slogans. However, the four clans which were earlier mentioned, Satsuma and Choshu, entered into alliance. Some of the Western agitations also had quite a few anti-Western agitators in the car. So, Satsuma and Choshu took part with that, and military alliance was established in the year 1866. At the same time, Sacho alliance it is called, leadership of Saigo Takamori was one of the most successful events just before Meiji restoration during transformation. The 16-year Meiji boy, who was emperor actually, who was restored the authority of highest supreme commander position as an emperor, he till the Meiji restoration, emperor's seat was located in Kyoto, and this image actually retrieved from Wikipedia is showing emperor in the box in between, carrier, and other foot soldiers, Ashigaru, and the horsemen moving from Kyoto all the way to Tokyo, that's then called Edo, that is city established by Ota Dokan on the rivers of Edo, in modern days what is called Tokyo. So, from Kyoto, shift of emperor, that is seat of power, to Tokyo is called actually shifting of the national capital from Kyoto to Tokyo. This is the image of Meiji emperor being moving from Kyoto to Tokyo. Some of the major Meiji reforms that were initiated in the initial years of Meiji restoration have had a far-reaching impact. Actually, abolition of samurai class, that is a military class. Actually, samurais were required to surrender their swords and thereby accept any civilian position in the newer government. And there was also in some places experienced rift in the government. However, during the Satsuma rebellion and the campaign for constitutional government and legislature that gradually was carried out, most of these former provincial heads or daimyos in the newer dispensation became virtually the governors. Much closer the contact with the national leadership is so much easier for the local leaders to become governors in the newer dispensation of creation or recreation of the entire administrative system throughout Japan into prefectures. Presently, what we see 47 prefecture of Japan is actually redrawn from the Japanese archipelago into newer modern Japan's political map. However, political parties also came up due to political institutions borrowing by Japanese leader from the European side. Jiu Minken Undo, that is civil rights and democratic movement which started just after the Meiji period, was another local event which has led to the speedier implementation of political institutions borrowing and instituting in Japan. And during that time, some of the major leaders who took part and who actually became national heads of this movement were one, for example, Okuma Shigenobu. His role during popular movements was very well credited in the Japanese history. At the same time, there was also founding of a National Assembly, that is Kokkai Kisei Domei, and this is a league which was actually founded then to follow creation of political parties and get represented in the national assemblies. Some of the leaders who formed political parties, for example, can be mentioned here. Itagaki Taisuke, and he formed Jiuto. Okuma Shigenobu, and also he started Kaishinto. Ito Hirobumi, the first Prime Minister of Japan, also he was in the Constitution Committee. A constitution based on the Prussian model was also introduced in Japan, which actually prevailed in Japan for all practical purposes till 1947, when newer present day 1947 constitution, or called post-war constitution, was placed. Till then it was Meiji constitution that was in force. This Meiji constitution was introduced in Japan on 29th day of November 1890. First parliamentary government in Asia was Japanese parliament. I think this is even today a credit that goes typically only to the Japanese. This is the image of Ito Hirobumi, the first Prime Minister of Japan, which actually is retrieved from Wikipedia. 1871, as a major feat of reform, Department of Education was established. Gakusei, or education system order, was introduced in the year 1872. 8 university districts were created, under which 32 middle school districts and each accommodating 210 primary school districts. Education order of 1886 also had a major feat of success in modernizing Japanese education system. Education, universal and compulsory for all the children, was introduced and made mandatory. Around this time, Imperial University Order of 1886 accommodated creation of University of Tokyo, even now continues. University of Kyoto, even now continues. Some of these are actually one of the most old and also at the same time most popular national universities, which have had its own role in contributing and also in transforming Japanese society, particularly the education of it. This is the image of Mori Arinori, founder of Japan's modern education system. Post-education reforms, imperial rescript was introduced. Actually, a military conscript made all able-bodied men above 15 years and up to 35 years compulsory military training and service. This had actually trained most of the Japanese to fight war and also to be sent overseas for fighting in the experiment of extension of Japanese empire into Asia. There was also a Subsidy Act for Technical Education, 1894, and first Western style spinning mill was set up in Gumma in the year 1874. There was also lack of economic infrastructure throughout the nation, that is shortage of bridges, proper rail and road network, and also a National Bank Act in 1872 was introduced, thanks to which 4 national banks, including the Mitsui Bank, were established. Lack of economic infrastructure we should emphasize. Hitherto, being a feudal Japan, there was not a good network of roads for any transportation purposes, even men, goods and material. And it was in the initial period of Meiji that a national network of road created, especially for 4, one for the south, one for the north, and then linking central Japan into Tokyo and from northern Japan into Tokyo. Actually, the central part of Japan, from where distance to rest of Japan is calculated, is even now located in a place called Nihonbashi in the center of Tokyo. Lack of infrastructure in Japan was not necessarily in a network of roadways. There was also a critical scarcity of other means of transport. Railway network was planned and introduced in Japan. The very first railway line was introduced between Tokyo and Yokohama in the year 1872. Actually, a short distance of 28 miles, say about 40-42 kilometers from Tokyo Central, and railway station, including Tokyo Central Railway Station, which is now renovated in the same style as in 1872 when it was first established. And Yokohama was the first connection to Tokyo Central. Then gradually railway network throughout the nation was extended. However, there was no mining and steel and shipbuilding, which were all necessary for expansion into overseas. Major creation of huge trading houses were encouraged to return to business. Emergence of what we call is Zaibatsu, that is a huge trading corporation under which virtually ownership, production running, exporting and even import of raw materials, all these were encouraged. Some of the great names in the Zaibatsu of those days, that is of Meiji period, can be named as Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Yasuda, and not just these. There were many of the other order in these businesses. Mining rights were given to. However, we must say, when we say mining rights were given to private large Zaibatsu houses, there was actually no resource in Japan. Even now, there are no natural resources in Japan except coal. Coal mines were limited geographically, some in Hokkaido, some in Kyushu. Of course, right now, that is the year 2015, we do not see any mine and mining activity in Japan because of exhausting all the existing resources by then. And during that time, building of steel and shipbuilding industry were some of the major activity. This is for basic construction industry throughout of any structure of modern nature and technology implementation required steel and shipbuilding industry. Japanese Meiji government virtually encouraged these, and most of the Meiji period industries subsequently, even in post-war period, consumer industries, we see being located on the southern side of the Pacific, that is say from Tokyo to Nagoya via Shizuoka prefecture. This is the region, and then again from Osaka towards Yamaguchi prefecture in Honshu. Honshu Island actually is the mainstay of Japanese manufacturing activity from Meiji period even now. And this emergence of Zaibatsu, who actually right from writing pencil till about supersonic aircraft, some of these companies involvement to Mitsubishi example makes pencil, makes all other stationaries and also trades vehicle, trades mining resources from overseas, all activities they are involved in. Zaibatsu, when we say it is huge commercial establishment. Besides the rise and consolidation of Zaibatsus and commercial activities and interests consolidation by these business houses, also there was a growth of military industries, the license of which also prevailed with these Zaibatsu houses. However, it is a collision of military interests and military personnel, military leadership and their intervention in decision making process and colliding their interest with that of Zaibatsu interest, that is the economic interest and military interest together virtually led to look for resources overseas and thereby extend the Japanese empire into that of Asia. All these were happening only during the Meiji period, meaning it is economic necessities that has virtually led to expansion of Japanese empire into Asia. If we can understand this sentence better, analyze this sentence better, we can see how Japan's economic and military rise in Asia also happened during that period. From the time of Meiji era, when it started in the year 1868, Japan was a debt-ridden nation. By the time when Meiji era concluded with the death of Meiji Emperor in the year 1912, Japan actually had become a trading surplus nation, from debt to trade surplus. This is the transformation which we call in economics really re-emergence of non-European countries into position of independence and preeminence. Lack of raw materials, other resources virtually led to military expansionism. During Meiji period, one of the major characteristics we can even now remember and credit Japan for remaining mostly a nationalist country is rise of nationalism. Actually, from mild version of nationalism, it had reached a hyper nationalism. There were quite a few nationalist schools of thought which were trying to promote their own brand of nationalism. If only I can mention 2 or 3 such schools of thought were Ryogoku, Kokugaku, Rengaku and Yogoku. These were some of the schools. Mitogoku cannot be forgotten. Now, right now it is in Mito is one of the major reasons in Ibaraki prefecture, and it's there this school of thought was located. However, nationalism became one of the major features of Meiji period, and this kind of a nationalism which virtually one can see during war, how kamikaze, that is the expression of Japanese nationalism in military, one can see in the term of kamikaze, that is actually divine wind. Virtually suicide bombers, as we call now, they were of those type those days. And here one thing must be clearly said, that nationalism Japan has virtually led to military unification, military strength, military recruitment and military exercising its powers overseas. The excesses the military committed in non-Japanese land, actually part of the empire in China and in South Korea, which now rises, then it was one Korea. Korean peninsula was annexed by Japanese in the year 1910, and war with China was won in the year 1895. In between, in 1904 and 5, Japan won a war against Russia, and also in 1902 they had an alliance with British. So, Anglo-Japanese alliance, victory in war against China, war against Russia, annexation of Korea, all these required most of the Japanese soldiers to be stationed overseas, continuously engaged in fighting and extending Japanese empire was one of the major reasons that gave consolidation of authority to the Japanese empire then. Political reforms one should not forget. When we say this, parliamentary form of administration was introduced. Japanese politics, does not have its own roots, but however it is rooted in the Japanese culture, Japanese society, Japanese norm. However, it is from West the political institutions were borrowed. Elections were introduced, parties were found, parliament was found, and then gradually towards politicization of the entire national mindset also happened. However, whoever the political leaders, whoever the political ruling party in coalition with the military and the economic interests represented by the business leaders, the Japanese empire had seen only its march and conquering most part of East Asia, what we call today, that is China and Korea included. And however, when social reforms, when we say besides education, there were other reforms. Women did not have political rights to cast their votes or preferences in balloting. We can say that women virtually took to. When transformation of society from feudal to modern occurred, it is not necessary that only the former feudal type of dress code continued. No, all those leaders and all those who had Western education obtained, who returned to Japan, they all transformed even their personality. The former long hair raised by men gone. Now, Western style of hair cutting were introduced. Even women went to have their bob cuts, not necessarily. They even adopted into Western dress code. For example, men into three-piece suits and women skirt and blouse. Actually wearing a black hat and also having a transparent veil and even blackening their teeth. These became some kind of a elite symbol in Japanese elite society. And simply putting on Western dress, carrying an umbrella, waiting in Tokyo station for a train to take a journey to Yokohama and return also became more or less the habit of the elite class those days. Even eating Western style of food, these also. However, living in Japanese environment, typically in the Japanese traditional environment and fancying outside Western thoughts, this is how Japan transformed from feudal to modern, and that is the Meiji period's transformation. Meiji is not a restoration, Meiji is not a revolution from top, Meiji is not necessarily only reforms, Meiji is also transformation of thought from typically traditional Japanese to Western modern. And this is how we can conclude finally that with the transformation of society from feudal to modern, by introducing reforms in varieties of sector, education included, military, political, all this has seen Japan enter into modern age with modern age, all strength obtained, technology obtained, industrialization in place, society transformed even in terms of income. Thereby, all people who had paid 10 yen, for example, as tax became eligible for voting. So, even the voting constituency that way was expanded, although it was limited only to the taxpayers initially. However, it was in the year 1925, that is much after Meiji restoration, that political rights were extended to all able and adult male population of Japan. So, Meiji reforms, Meiji restoration, Meiji revolution, all we understand nothing but a transformation of feudal Japan into modern Japan. A sentence or two on Japanese economic policies during Meiji restoration may be in order as we are talking of reforms. Economic reforms, Japan even in contemporary period is also struggling to introduce and lift from no growth period to stable growth period. Right now it is actually in negative growth. Economic policies, when we say beginning 1871, National Bank Act was created in Japan. With that establishment of national banks and banks for the national scale by private business houses were also encouraged. National banks 4 were in number with the creation of Mitsui Bank put in the beginning. There is a central banking system Japan. Even today, central banking system in Japan continues. Central bank in Japan is called Bank of Japan, and in India, if we want to compare it to, it is something like our Reserve Bank. And private banks were encouraged. Money as an investment capital was very, very important those days, and sometimes national government could not afford itself. So, banks were authorized as a main function of theirs plus other financial institution was to print currency and release it for circulation in the country. Any additional money introduced for circulation by printing leads to inflation, usually, as we say. Inflation, we common people anywhere understand as price rise. Price rise is not inflation. Inflation is actually additional release of money for circulation in an economy. That leads to demand for goods, therefore, prices rise. Impact of introduction of newer currency and bills for circulation in an economy by the central bank is on prices of the commodity. When prices rise, it is because of more money available in the society with the people. And also, whenever huge expenditure Japanese government had budgeted, that was for the purpose of creating major infrastructure facilities in the country. So, for that they also had introduced bond issuance to the public, raising public money via issuance of bonds for investment in primary sectors of construction of facilities of national scale projects throughout Japan. This was one which was made possible. And in order not to depend only on the national banks, many of the Zaibatsu, that is huge trading companies, had their own banks instituted. Sometimes when government went weaker in financial terms, some of the huge private banks and huge private business houses lent money to the Japanese government, to the imperial expenditure. Anyway, this is one. And number two, gradually as economic development advanced, also the tax base in the nation also increased. Tax, we understand, is nothing but a compulsory contribution made by the citizens of a country towards the common expenditure of the government. This is the formal definition of tax term, and the base of this tax gradually expanded throughout the nation. That explains simply economic activity expansion. Japan also became an economic power. It is not necessarily as a miracle post-war Japan transformed from defeat and occupation to an economic powerhouse. No, even before World War II, Japan was an economic power besides being a military power, and Japanese economic activities also increased the tax base of Japanese, thereby providing some kind of a balanced budget throughout.